Next delegation is James Wilt to be heard with respect to budget review item 4. James, you're now live with the Standing Policy Committee on Infrastructure, Renewal and Public Works. You can proceed with your presentation.
Thanks so much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
So great. Yeah, thank you. My name's James Wilt. I'm a PhD student at the University of Manitoba. And I'm usually a dedicated transit rider who loves using the 36 Super Express to get to and from the U of M, but obviously things have changed recently. I'm also the author of a recently published book about public transit. I've done online speaking events throughout COVID-19 by organizations based in New York City, Toronto, Edmonton, Hamilton, and Ottawa. So I'm pleased to be here today to speak to the preliminary 2021 operating and capital budget. I'd first like to note that it's a great thrill to participate in budget proceedings via video conferencing. This is something that we were told by the city last year was impossible, and it required many delegations to risk their own health and the health of loved ones to appear at EPC in March. Yet has now been shown to be completely possible. So as is usually the case, the concerns of people fighting for disability justice should have been listened to far sooner than this. With that said, I'd also like to echo the concerns voiced by previous delegations who note that the significant delay in today's committee meetings is unacceptable. I'm in my first year of PhD classwork and should be focusing on final papers and assignments, and instead I've just been sitting on my hands basically waiting for the opportunity to speak based on what I understand is the chair's failure to check in about potential conflict of interest at any point before the meeting's commencement. So to my presentation itself, I understand that Winnipeg and the world is unprecedented times. COVID-19 has reduced transit ridership by 80 to 85% across North America. The Canadian Urban Transit Association estimates that transit systems have been losing $400 million a month throughout the pandemic. Winnipeg Transit reports losing $38 million in fare revenue from 2020 to 2021. And I'm very sympathetic to the fact that municipalities cannot run deficits and are heavily reliant on higher levels of government for intervention. I also know that the federal government has designated $64.8 million in possible transit allocation if and when the province cost matches it, and so far the province has only accessed $33 million of that. I'm also aware that the province has frozen the 50-50 cost sharing agreement at $42 million, and as years go on, that is implicitly a cut. So this, among other things, is why I participated in the National Keep Transit Moving campaign a few days ago, which saw transit workers and drivers from across the country collectively call for more federal operating funding. We called the Prime Minister, the Deputy Prime Minister, and our local MP to call for more operating funding for transit agencies, including Winnipeg Transit. I'd also like to commend councillors on securing the following policies: fare-free transit for youth, the elimination of the 500-meter rule for Transit Plus, and a low-income bus pass, although the latter is still far more expensive than what it should be, in my opinion. These are positive steps. Now, with all that said, I want to focus attention on what this committee and city can do to increase service during this critical time. As was just laid out by Derek Koop of Functional Transit, Transit will be receiving a one-time mill rate boost this year to $104.3 million in 2021, up from $67.3 million in 2020. It's frankly quite difficult to tell from this budget how much of this increase comes from the $32.3 million accessed by Winnipeg through the federal Safe Restart funding. But of course, this mill rate increase is welcome and necessary. Unfortunately, as outlined by Functional Transit Winnipeg, the transit budget still sees cuts to its operating expenditure, including a 4% cut to operating this year, decreasing from $193 million in the 2020 adopted budget to $185.2 million in 2021. This accompanies the maintaining of a 6% reduction in bus operating hours, which the city is attributing to cancellation of in-person classes at post-secondary institutions, which is quite understandable. I recognize that it doesn't make any sense to run empty accordion buses to the U of M with nobody on them, as much fun as that would be for the riders. But we should be reallocating these buses and drivers to other routes that we know are experiencing chronic and dangerous overcrowding. As expertly laid out in the 9 Steps report submitted earlier today to the Standing Policy Committee, such overcrowding disproportionately impacts transit users with disabilities. I don't need to tell any of you that one of the keys to confronting the coronavirus is social distancing. However, that is impossible on many routes in Winnipeg due to just constant overcrowding and not enough bus service. So what we need to be doing is running more buses than usual, not fewer. There's drivers and buses that can and should be reallocated to other routes with increased operating funding, rather than cutting that funding in response to lower ridership to the U of M and to the U of W. A bit of survey data. This isn't Winnipeg specific, but I think it will help us think through some of these things. So in May, there was a survey done of Toronto transit riders, and it found that 82% of transit riders who stopped taking transit during the pandemic said that enforcing limits on the number of passengers per vehicle would make them more likely to return. And from Winnipeg transit operators who I've spoken to, there is a limit of 15 people for a conventional standard bus. However, that is rarely maintained because of the lack of buses on the road. A Statistics Canada report similarly from August about commuting to work during COVID found that of people who used public transit before the pandemic and who said that they were not comfortable going back to their usual place of work once things get back underway as usual, 94% reported that fear of using public transit was one of their concerns about returning to physical workplaces. And of those who said that they actually felt safe returning, 74% said that they were very or extremely concerned about using public transit. So these are very stark numbers. So it's abundantly clear that the response to this crisis should be to operate more frequent and more reliable transit to ensure that people can get where they need to go when they need to go. So this includes not only workplaces if and when they reopen, but in the context of COVID, groceries, medical appointments, and caring for family and friends while staying safe at the same time. So this would be true in any situation, but especially in the middle of a climate crisis. If we see a mass migration of riders away from transit into personal automobiles, including ride-hailing services that Council foolishly allowed in recently, we are guaranteed to see higher transportation emissions, including greenhouse gases and air pollution, more congestion, greater danger for pedestrians and cyclists, less access to affordable transportation, especially for low or no income people, lack of accessibility for people with disabilities, and undermine labor rights for workers. Another thing that this crisis has made clear is that relying on fare revenue for such a significant portion of operating funding leaves transit exposed to extreme volatility. 51.8% of operating funding for transit in 2022 is projected to come from fares, up from 33% of operating funding in the unprecedented year of 2021. While I also hope that things will have returned to normal by then, this is a highly risky proposition that may leave the transit budget increasingly exposed if ridership does not return as anticipated. And we also know who poor transit service disproportionately impacts: low-wage shift workers, people with disabilities, seniors, and those who can't or choose not to drive, and thus don't have an alternative option of getting food, medical help, and access to social services. This was particularly pronounced by the city's cruel and unusual cancellation of the highly successful Downtown Spirit, which was the only real incarnation of free transit we've had in the city. So echoing functional transit, I would like to make two clear calls to this committee. Number one is to reverse the cuts to transit's operating expenditure in 2021 and not only restore service, but increase it to account for overcrowding. And number two, pass a motion calling on the province to cost match the remaining federal funding on the table and to unfreeze the 50-50 cost sharing arrangement between the city and the province. I just took a little bit of time to look up when the last time a motion was submitted to the province or passed to call on the province on the 50-50 arrangement. And from what I can tell, it was 2017. And in my opinion, we need a more recent update to that. And there's many examples throughout the years of council passing motions to call on the province to do various things, such as to hike or to fund rapid transit lines using vehicle registration fees and such. Finally, I'd like to note that while the city is in a uniquely difficult position, there are clear alternatives to what this budget is proposing. The results of the online survey for budget engagement are reported on page 10 and page 11 of this budget. Here are a few of the highlights, which I'll just skim through as I realize I'm close to the end of time. The Winnipeg Police Service received the most feedback of all city services, mostly focused around shifting budgets towards community supports. Community services and public transit are the number one and number two budget priority. The three most important services identified in the survey are medical response, community livability, and public transit. And the least three important services are golf services, parking, and police. Yet we're seeing total operational expenditures for the Winnipeg Police increase by $6.7 million in 2021, with total spending increased by $8.6 million. And while the Winnipeg Police has been instructed to find $5.1 million in reductions this year, salaries and pensions are still going up by over $11 million this year. And so I asked, obviously, to this committee, but also to council, how can this possibly be reconciled? The city's own surveys demonstrate the residents view public transit as important while viewing police as not. Further, we've seen many indications of a popular desire to move away from police-centric policymaking, including thousands of people attending the Justice for Black Lives rally in June and its online petition supporting 115,000 signatures. So I'll conclude by reiterating 3 key points. Reverse the service cuts to transit, pass a motion to call on the province for more funding, and respect the survey feedback and demands from many organizations in the city calling for cuts to the police budget and reallocation to community services and public transit. Thank you for your time.